Ryan, tell us what's on your radar.
From the 1960s and 70s, Herat, Kandahar, and Kabul were all major stops on what was known then as the hippie trail. It wasn't unusual for hippies looking to see a new part of the world to spend a few months there. In 1973, after Timothy Leary escaped prison, the DEA found him in Kabul. It was a cosmopolitan, forward-looking scene, and its politics reflected that attitude. Outside of the city centers, life went on much as it had for centuries. But in 1978, a radical element within the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or the PDPA, which was the local Communist Party, staged a coup and took power. The Soviet Union was actually alarmed. What a lot of people don't understand about the Soviet Union after World War II is that they spent much of their time urging their allies around the world not to get too crazy. The Soviets were partial to the moderate wing of the PDPA, and they counseled against a number of mistakes the communists ended up making. As journalist Christian Parenti, who joined us here yesterday, has written, the Soviets rejected 13 requests from the party to come in and help. As one Soviet official replied, quote, "We have carefully studied all aspects of this action and come to the conclusion that if our troops were introduced, the situation in your country would not only not improve, but would worsen," unquote. But it was an assassination that eventually brought them in. In 1979, President Taraki was assassinated on the order of Prime Minister Hafizullah Amin. The Soviets thought Amin had gone too far. They invaded, cornered him, and killed him, installing a new leader. The United States, fresh off its loss in Vietnam, saw an opportunity to inflict a Vietnam on its enemy, and it ramped up its support to the Mujahideen, including this fellow. In February 1989, the Soviet Union finally left. The next month, the United Mujahideen made their move to take over the country, and the Afghan government fought them off, sending them into disarray. The Soviets hoped then that the U.S. would forge a national reconciliation, and some elements of the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, wanted to do that. But others argued instead for bleeding the Afghans as much as possible. So we continued funding the war against them. Yet the PDPA, now under Mohammad Najibullah, held strong for another 3 years before finally falling to our Mujahideen. If you missed it yesterday, I asked Parenti why the Soviets' client state was able to hold on for 3 years while ours could barely make it 3 months.
It was also actually committed to development and had delivered meaningful economic change to people, and that's what won the loyalty of particularly the populations in the cities, which held on to the very end. It's because the money wasn't by and large stolen. It was manifest as clean drinking water, jobs with decent wages, and a general improvement in the standard of living for people.
Once Kabul fell, the lights literally went out, and the country descended into civil war, which the world was content to ignore. The Taliban eventually emerged from this civil war as the victorious faction and took over in 1996. Their imported extremism wasn't popular, but their ability to actually govern in areas they controlled and their reputation for anti-corruption gave them a base of support. They found Najibullah holed up in a UN compound in Kabul, grabbed him, tortured him, castrated him, and killed him. The Taliban's rule would only get worse from there, as our one-time asset Osama bin Laden set up shop in Afghanistan and began plotting the work he's now remembered for. When the U.S. invaded after 9/11, the Taliban quickly offered to surrender and also offered to turn Osama bin Laden over to a third party to be tried. For years, when conflict had ended in Afghanistan, one side surrendered and was brought back into society. That's how it works in a civil war, when your opponents don't have a country to go home to. That's how it worked here in our civil war. But the U.S. said no and rejected the surrender, preferring all-out war instead. In the face of the American onslaught, most Taliban fighters faded from the battlefield, and they ceded the country to the warlords that had previously been in power. Those warlords, however, were not tasked by their American overseers with creating an inclusive government that provided for the material or cultural benefit of the Afghan people. Instead, the main task given them was to find and hunt Taliban or al-Qaeda fighters, to help with drone strike targeting, and to help build up an Afghan national army that, theoretically at least, could stand on its own once the U.S. left. But there weren't many Taliban left, and there were close to zero al-Qaeda. So the warlords largely manufactured enemies, sicking the U.S. military on internal rivals. Instead of any serious development, the warlords stole the reconstruction money and funneled it to bank accounts in Dubai. And so, within weeks of the U.S. leaving Afghanistan, the figment of a government evaporating quite probably sold for cash to the Taliban. The images are disturbing, but it's better than a 4-year civil war that leaves hundreds of thousands dead and the country in ruins. Now, I certainly didn't think I'd be spending my time defending Joe Biden's foreign policy decisions, but here we are. And Biden was right yesterday when he said this.
So I'm left again to ask of those who argue that we should stay. How many more generations of America's daughters and sons would you have me send to fight Afghanistan's civil war when Afghan troops will not? How many more lives, American lives, is it worth? How many endless rows of headstones at Arlington National Cemetery? I'm clear on my answer. I will not repeat the mistakes we've made in the past.
We should have accepted their surrender when it was offered. We never needed to go there in the first place. And we never should have funded those extremists just to make the Soviet Union's life on its periphery difficult. We've spent the last half-century making people's lives in Afghanistan more difficult or ending their lives entirely. And we've spent trillions doing it. I think that's enough. Kim, I'm curious if you think the United States will actually learn any lessons from this 50-year debacle.
Probably not, maybe for a few years, but in the end, I think we're probably going to end up waging more wars if history were to repeat itself. But I think one point you really made in this, when you're kind of going back through the history of Afghanistan and the Mujahideen, with Operation Cyclone, which started under Jimmy Carter, who, he just seems like such a sweet man, but unfortunately was kind of one of the beginning people that kind of got this whole thing started. You essentially argue, or you make the point that we sort of won the war when you think about it, I guess. Yes.
Right.
We funded the Mujahideen started in 1979 through the 80s. They became, so I guess we got what we wanted. Ultimately, it's just, so Jimmy Carter, hey, everybody, Jimmy Carter won the war.
Congratulations to our boys for their, successful conquering of Kabul over the weekend. It took a long time.
Many decades.
But here they are.
Well, and just going through that history, which is fascinating, Ryan, and I think gives really good perspective. It does make it feel like time is a flat circle. I was, as I've mentioned, in Kabul in the last administration when we announced peace talks with the Taliban and with President Ashraf Ghani. And I remember it was pointed out to me by some of the war correspondents there, the different members of the Mujahideen who were now members of the Taliban leadership. And it just shows that this continued presence in various different forms that it's taken over the last 40 years has just consistently contributed to where we are today. I don't think actually any of us disagree that had we been able to, hindsight's 2020, taken that deal much earlier in the 2000s and accepted the Taliban surrender, how many U.S. lives would have been saved? How many Afghan security forces' lives would have been saved? But unfortunately, the war machine has a way of continuing to just, truck along no matter what we're actually accomplishing. But I think it's fascinating perspective, and you really can't look at this current terrible moment in Afghanistan without analyzing the past 40 years of U.S. involvement there.
And it's wild. While our former allies were on the Mujahideen side, or on the Taliban side, our former enemies, who were in the Najibullah government, they themselves were then on the U.S. side. Everybody's switching sides in these buffer zones in the war between empires. But coming up, Team Rising weighs in on the media's coverage of what's happening in Afghanistan and the warning everyone may have missed from General Milley when Rising returns.